Welcome to a fascinating exploration of chess psychology and strategy. Today we examine one of Emanuel Lasker's most intriguing games where he performed a brilliant queen sacrifice. Unlike typical sacrifices aimed at gaining a direct tactical or positional advantages, Lasker's sacrifice in this game was purely psychological. He skillfully created chaos and imbalance on the board, leading his opponent into a labyrinth of confusion and indecision. Although Lasker's position was not objectively better after the sacrifice, his deep understanding of human nature allowed him to dominate the game. Join me as we analyze how Lasker turned the psychological tables, proving that in chess the battle is not just on the board, but also in the mind. Lasker's opponent, Ilyin Zhenevsky, starts with e4. Lasker plays the Sicilian defense, c5. White plays knight c3. It seems that he's going to play the closed Sicilian. Lasker plays e6, knight f3, d6, g3. Lasker develops his king's knight, knight f6, bishop g2, bishop e7, both sides castle, and now in case white plays d3, the closed Sicilian would have arisen. But instead white plays b3. The system which was quite popular in those days. The idea is quite straightforward. White is going to fianchetto his dark squared bishop. By playing b3 he also took under control the c4 square, so he's going to play d4 after that, and after the exchange of the pawns on the d4 square, the d file would become half open, so white major pieces will exert a strong pressure on the backward d6 pawn. After that, white is going to move away his c3 knight, unblocking the c pawn, and push it to c4. And on c4 the pawn will be supported by the b3 pawn. So the c4 pawn together with the e4 pawn will control the d5 square, restricting black, so black won't be able to push his backward d pawn forward. So black's position will be completely restricted after that, after which, besides putting pressure on the d file, white will start an attack on the king side by pushing his f pawn forward, after preparatory moves, of course, such as king h1, for example. Lasker now develops his queen's knight, knight c6, bishop b2, bishop d7, d4, now the d file opens, c takes d, knight takes d4, and Lasker develops his queen, queen a5. White plays queen d2, developing the queen, connecting the rooks, and vacating the d1 square for the rook, in order to increase the pressure on the half-open d file. Lasker makes a standard Sicilian move, rook c8, developing the rook and putting pressure on the half-open c file, and white develops his rook, and besides increasing the pressure on the d file, by playing rook d1, white has created an immediate threat. By playing rook d1, he has defended his queen. That means the c3 knight might move at any moment, with the discovered attack on the black queen. For example, in case black makes an inaccurate move a6, white first would eliminate the c6 knight, which is the only defender of the black queen, and after this his knight will jump on d5 with the discovered attack on the black queen and also attacking the unguarded bishop. In case black exchanges the queens, that would be a blunder, because before recapturing the queen, white would make an in-between move, knight takes e7 check. With a check, that's very important, black must move his king, and only after that white would recapture the queen and white would be up a piece. So after knight d5 in this variation, black cannot exchange the queens, he must retreat to d8 in order to defend his bishop, after which white would eliminate the very important bishop, because this bishop is the key defender of black's main weakness on d6, and after this exchange it isn't clear how black is going to defend his backward pawn, because it's under pressure. Of course, white's e4 pawn is also under attack, but white can easily defend this pawn, and then if needed white can increase the pressure on the pawn and this pawn will fall, so white would be better. For this reason, after rook d1, as knight d5 is threatened, Lasker makes a prophylactic move, king h8. Now this variation with knight takes c6 followed by knight d5 doesn't work, of course, because black would simply capture the queen and white knight cannot capture on e7 because it would come without a check. So in this case, black would be up a piece. So instead of all this, white plays in accordance with his initial plan. He plays knight e2 in order to unblock the c-pawn, so he's going to push the pawn to c4 next move. Besides that, by playing knight e2, white offers the exchange of the queens. So we have reached the critical position. What should black do now? Shall he exchange the queens, avoid the exchange of the queens, or maybe come up with some fantastic psychological idea? You can pause the video and try to find Lasker's brilliant idea. So, in case black exchanges the queens, that would be in white's favor, because after rook takes d2, white will play c4 next move, completely restricting black's position, and after that he will increase the pressure on the d-file. If needed, again, he can play bishop a3, and black wouldn't have any counterplay, black would suffer in this case. In case black avoids the exchange of the queens and moves his queen, let's say, to b6, again, the same would be the case. White would play c4, completely restrict black's position, black would struggle to get a counterplay, and white would be better. In case black doesn't react, in case he neither exchanges the queens nor moves away his queen and plays, let's say, a6, again, the same would be the case. White would play c4, black wouldn't have any counterplay, would be restricted, white would be better. So, instead of all this, Lasker plays queen takes a2, which had a shocking effect, because his opponent was absolutely sure that this pawn, the a2 pawn, was untouchable. Because in case black captures it, his queen would get trapped. And that's exactly what happened. White plays rook a1, attacking the queen must capture the bishop, and after rook b1, the queen doesn't have any squares to move. So Lasker captures on b1, and now after rook takes b1, we can see Lasker's idea. So, materially, the position is more or less equal. For the queen, Lasker has a rook, a minor piece, and a pawn. From a purely chess perspective, Lasker's idea wasn't so strong. The computer even gives a slight advantage to white in this position. But from the psychological point of view, Lasker's idea was fantastic. The sacrifice has completely changed the character of the position. In this new position, white's initial standard plan of attacking on the king side doesn't have prospects anymore, because he doesn't have a bishop. This bishop was supposed to play a very important role in the attack on the black king. Neither white has the rook, because white was going to play f4 followed by either f5 or e5, and in this case he always needs a rook on f1. But now he doesn't have the rook. That means white doesn't have the sufficient amount of attacking resources for the successful attack on the black king. Besides that, black has a lot of pieces on the king side to defend his king. So that means white's initial plan doesn't have any prospects. So with his sacrifice, Lasker deprived his opponent of the most natural plan. So white must come up with an absolutely new plan in this disbalanced, chaotic, imbalanced, chaotic position, which isn't an easy task. Besides that, Lasker knew that most probably his opponent would think that Lasker simply blundered his queen, which would lead his opponent to continue playing in accordance with his initial plan, and by doing so, white would just weaken his position. So now Lasker simply gradually improves his pieces, letting his opponent make mistakes. So Lasker isn't in a hurry. First, he improves his rook. Rook d8. White plays in accordance with his initial plan, c4, which makes sense, so white takes under control the d5 square, restricting black's position. However, now that white doesn't have a pawn on a2, and this pawn could have moved to a3 in order to control the b4 square, that means by playing c4, white has permanently weakened the b4 square, so Lasker will occupy this square, as you will see. Lasker now, again, he isn't in a hurry, he keeps improving his pieces. He plays knight e8. The idea is to reroute the knight to c7, from which it will take under control the important squares and support the b5 advance. By playing b5, Lasker is going to create a counterplay on the queen side. And now white's next move shows that Lasker's mind game worked very well. So white here had to come up with a new plan. But which plan should he opt for? He doesn't have any natural plan. So probably, although computer shows that white is slightly better, from the human perspective, it isn't easy to play for white. Probably it would be better for white to simply consolidate his position. As he doesn't have a plan, probably it would be better to exchange on c6, followed by knight d4. But as Lasker expected, instead of this, white keeps playing in accordance with his initial plan. He is thinking about the attack on the king side and plays f4. However, he wouldn't get any attack on the king side, and by playing f4, he just weakened his king side. Lasker keeps playing slowly, gradually improving his position. a6, taking under control the b5 square and still preparing the advance of the b pawn. White makes a prophylactic move, as by playing f4 he has weakened this diagonal, so he moves the king away to h1. Lasker plays knight c7, and probably now, white finally understood that his attack on the king side doesn't have any prospects. He paid attention that he doesn't have a bishop, he doesn't have a rook, so now he starts making moves that don't make any sense, because he doesn't have a plan, and without a plan, as Lasker himself used to say, it isn't easy to play. It's better to play in accordance with a bad plan than without a plan at all. And that's exactly what happens to white. He's playing without a plan now. First he plays queen e3, probably to move away the queen from the possible x-ray on the d-file, while Lasker keeps playing logically. Rook b8, in order to support the advance of his b-pawn. Now white plays rook d1, occupying the half-open d-file, however the d6 pawn is defended by the bishop. Now Lasker improves his knight, occupying the weak square, knight b4. By playing knight b4 he now invades white's territory. The first black piece crosses the center of the board. White plays queen c3, which again, it isn't clear what white achieves by playing queen c3. He is attacking the knight, of course, but Lasker reinforces his knight by playing a5. Now this knight will remain on this square. At first sight, it might seem that by playing a5, black lost control over the b5 square. However, it isn't the case. He doesn't actually need the pawn on a6 in order to push the b pawn forward, because the knight, the bishop and the rook all control the b5 square, and these pieces will support the advance of the b pawn. Besides that, by playing a6, Lasker has vacated this square for the c7 knight. So the knight via a6 can be rerouted to c5, and on c5 the knight would be greatly placed on this great blockading square. So, white still doesn't know what to do, and black is going to play b5 next move, opening the b file and creating a very good counterplay on the queen side. So, as white doesn't have a plan, he tries to at least prevent black's idea. So he plays rook a1, attacking the a5 pawn and preventing b5. In case black plays b5, of course, white would capture on a5. But Lasker isn't in a hurry. White doesn't have any active plan anyways, so he simply defends the a5 pawn by playing b6. And most probably, next move, Lasker is going to play bishop f6, improving his bishop this time. On f6, the bishop would be greatly placed, exerting very unpleasant pressure on this diagonal, because white has two major pieces on this diagonal, the rook and the queen. So probably white should, now in the anticipation of possible bishop f6, should think about moving these major pieces away from this diagonal. But what should he play? In case he moves the rook to d1, which looks like the most natural square for the rook, white would stop attacking the a5 pawn, and that would mean that the b6 pawn doesn't need to defend the a5 pawn anymore, and black can immediately push the pawn forward, and after the possible exchanges on b5, black would get a very good counterplay. The b file is open, as you see. Computer still shows the equality, but it would be much easier to play this position for black. It's clear what black is going to do. He's continue to improve his pieces, increase the pressure on the b file. White has a weakness on b3, while for white it isn't still easy to find a plan. So white didn't move his rook from a1 in order to keep the a5 pawn under attack. So he should move his queen from this diagonal. And it would be better to move the queen to f3. Which didn't happen in the game. In this case, Lasker would get a chance to continue to improve his pieces. For example, he can reroute his passive knight from c7 to c5. Both of his knights would be greatly placed. Then he can play bishop f6, improving his bishop. So Lasker would gradually improve his position in this case. But it would be relatively better for white. The position would still remain more or less equal. But, as Lasker expected, his opponent now blunders. Because without a plan, when you don't have a plan in a chaotic position, of course you will blunder. What can be more natural? So, instead of queen f3, white plays queen e3. And this move is a blunder because it lets black play knight c2, forking the rook and the queen. Not right away, because the white knight defends this square, so Lasker first kicks the knight out of d4 by playing e5. In case white captures on e5, that doesn't change anything, because the d6 pawn would recapture and still the knight would be under attack, so white moves his knight away from d4 right away, attacking the bishop. So first Lasker exchanges this knight, and only after this plays knight c2, forking the rook and the queen, and after queen c3 captures on a1, and now for the queen Lasker has 2 rooks and a pawn. Besides that, he has a pawn majority on the queen side, 3 pawns against 2 pawns. That means he can create a passed pawn on the queen side. But again, Lasker isn't in a hurry. First he keeps improving his pieces. Bishop f6, threatening to capture on f4 with the discovered attack on the white queen. So white moves his queen away from the bishop's diagonal. And now, finally, Lasker plays d5 in order to deflect the c4 pawn from this square, so that his pawns move forward and to create a passed pawn on the a file. White is forced to capture on d5, otherwise the d pawn itself would move forward and would turn into a passed pawn, and it isn't clear how white is going to stop this pawn. So white captures on d5, and now, as you see, black can easily create a passed pawn on the queen side. But first, of course, Lasker captures on d5, white captures on e5, bishop takes e5, and while black's plan is clear, it isn't clear what white should do. He still doesn't have a plan. So his last chance is to try to create an attack on the king side. So he plays g4. But Lasker keeps consolidating his position. f6, reinforcing his bishop, blockading the f5 pawn, now it cannot move forward, and also taking under control the g5 square, so the g pawn cannot move forward either. And both of these pawns are placed on the light squares, and that makes white's light squared bishop completely useless in the attack on the black king. So, in case white plays bishop e4, for example, his f5 pawn would close his diagonal. So, white doesn't have any chances on the king side. He still keeps playing on the king side. What else can he do? h4, he continues his desperate attack, and Lasker now pushes his b pawn forward. b5. White activates his knight. Now this knight is white's most active piece. The knight might jump to c6 with a fork, or maybe to e6, which might be quite unpleasant, but with a precise move, Lasker now exchanges white's best piece. He plays knight e3. closing the queen's diagonal and opening his rook's file. So now that white knight is under attack. And white cannot move this knight. In case the knight moves, let's say to c6, black would play rook d1, and it turns out that the white queen would be pinned. For this reason, by playing knight e3, Lasker forces the exchange of the knights. White must capture the black knight, and black recaptures, black captures white's knight, and white is left with a useless bishop now, and with a queen which doesn't have any targets of attack. Besides that, the g4 pawn is also under attack, so white defends it, and now you see that by pushing his pawns on the king side, white simply weakened his king. Now his king is also in trouble. And Lasker pushes the a pawn finally, a4. h5, and now Lasker ignores white's threats and pushes the pawn forward, threatening a2. For this reason, white prevents it by playing queen e2, taking under control this square, but rook d8 followed, doubling the rooks, and there is no defense against rook d2, followed by a2 and a1. For this reason, in this position, white resigned. And now I recommend watching how world champion Mikhail Botvinnik set a psychological trap for David Bronstein in their world championship match. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.